So what I want to talk to you about in this design talk is randomness in games. Now, we already implemented some randomness in our snake game, and I think that just makes it better. It's more interesting, and that way the game is more fun to play over and over. But what kinds of randomness are there? Is it always good? Is it always bad, if you're a pessimist? And how often should you be using it? So there are two primary types of randomness that is agreed upon in games, and that is called output randomness and input randomness. Now, the two of them are kind of on a spectrum as they play with each other depending on how heavy you use one over the other. But you can think of input randomness as the player has no control. So if you're starting a game where a map is procedurally generated, like Minecraft or Civilization, that is input randomness. You had no control over it. The name is kind of deceiving. You had no control over it, and now you have to deal with it. You have to strategize around it. Sometimes the whole game is based around how you can deal with that input randomness. And then output randomness, on the other hand, is when you make a decision that is not guaranteed, such as shooting in XCOM where you have a percentage, or making a roll where you play a card and it has ability that it might hit a player a 50% chance. That is you taking an action and you have a chance to succeed. It's not guaranteed. So input randomness, you have no say over. The game actually inputs it and does something and then you react to it. Output is from us, the player. So those are the two types of randomness that you'll find when you start talking about it in video games. So is one better than the other, and is randomness good or bad in general? And that question is kind of deceiving, because depending on your experience and your feelings and how you like to play and make games, you'll have different feelings about randomness. And in some cases, you might not want any randomness in your game because it doesn't call for it. If you're doing a story-driven RPG, then you probably don't want randomness in your game, or at least in the combat section, because you want your player to always know that what they do is going to work. But if you're doing a strategy game or a game that involves a lot of luck, such as a board game where you have to roll dice, things like that, then randomness is required. And if you take that away, you take away a big part of that game. Now, it's not always a bad thing. If you've ever played Risk, you can understand the frustration of randomness when rolling dice. Now you take that away, and you essentially have Underworld, another board game where it's very similar to Risk, except that when you attack, if you have more troops, then you win. There's no randomness at all. So taking it away can create something entirely new that isn't good or bad either. So using them is the key to it. Doing too much or too little one or the other can lead to a bad experience. So not every game needs randomness, but when you have it, you want to make sure that it's fair to the player. So a lot of times in games, you'll actually end up what is called, but in video games, you'll also often find that randomness isn't actually what it says on the screen. You'll often find that programmers actually tip it in the player's favor. So something that XCOM does is if you take a lot of shots and you miss them, it'll actually make the next couple shots more likely to hit than what it actually says. Because as humans, it's really important for us to feel that the game is fair, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about fairness and what that is and how exactly to implement that in games. But if we are supposed to make a hit when we take a shot in a game and it says 87% and we miss, that's frustrating. If we take another 87% shot and we miss again, then we start feeling like the game is unfair. So developers will often tip it in the player's favor and make it more likely to hit if they've had failures recently. So in that case, it's not as much as a random as it is kind of cheating the system to make the game feel fair. But it still feels, or at least it looks random, and we're much happier when we get that. And a side note on randomness is that it's always better to play into the player's favor. So if you wanted to have a system where they make random actions, then it's okay if you weigh it in the player's favor, because the player will always be happy if something works for them when it seems, kind of risky. They'll be much happier if that happens, and they're not going to complain if they take a risky shot or they play a risky card and it pans out. That's great. And that's really all I want to say about it. We've talked about it quite a bit, and I think you should have a much better understanding of it now. Randomness can be great, and if you want to use it, do it. Just make sure you test it out plenty before you ship your final product so that you don't upset a lot of players. In the next video, I want to have another talk about what makes up a game. What are the essential components to a game, and does the game we just made have that? Let's talk about it next.